Chapter 13, The Poisoned Peace, How 440 Clauses Planted WWII Seeds. The euphoria of Armistice Day, November 11, 1918, was a collective sigh of relief, a moment of unimaginable joy that the killing had finally ceased. But the Great War, which had promised to be the war to end all wars, would instead bequeath a deeply poisoned peace. The treaties hammered out in the gilded halls of Paris were not the foundation for a lasting reconciliation, but rather a complex, often contradictory web of compromises, punishments, and unfulfilled promises. Their 440 clauses, meticulously crafted by the victorious powers, unwittingly laid the groundwork for the next, even more devastating global catastrophe, perpetuating the big lie that a stable future could be built on a foundation of vengeance and selective justice. The victors divide, conflicting visions for a new world. The arduous task of forging peace began in January 1919, as delegates from 32 countries converged on Paris. Yet, the real work, and the real clashes, occurred among the Big Four, the leaders of the principal Allied powers, each arriving with their own deeply ingrained beliefs, national agendas, and conflicting visions for the post-war world. The Big Four's clash: Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Orlando. The atmosphere in Paris was one of exhaustion and raw emotion, a city still scarred by the war, yet buzzing with the weight of global destiny. Presiding over the grand negotiations were four formidable personalities. Woodrow Wilson, United States. The American president was an idealist, a moralistic academic, and a visionary. He believed fervently in his 14 points as the blueprint for a just and lasting peace, centered on principles like self-determination, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to prevent future conflicts. Wilson saw himself as a global arbiter, detached from the vengeful realpolitik of Europe, and sought a peace based on principles rather than power. Georges Clemenceau, France the Tiger, as he was known, was the oldest and most cynical of the group. Having witnessed 2 German invasions of France in his lifetime, Clemenceau was driven by an unyielding desire for French security and bitter retribution. France had endured immense suffering, devastated northern territories, immense casualties, and a deep-seated fear of German resurgence. His singular aim was to cripple Germany permanently, ensure massive reparations, and reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. His famously blunt motto was, "Germany will pay." David Lloyd George, Great Britain. The shrewd and pragmatic British Prime Minister occupied the middle ground. He faced conflicting pressures. A vengeful British public demanded that Germany be made to squeeze until the pips squeak, yet he also recognized the dangers of a completely broken Germany, fearing it could lead to economic instability or fall prey to Bolshevism. Lloyd George sought a stable European balance that would allow Britain to resume lucrative trade, and aimed for a compromise between Wilson's idealism and Clemenceau's punitive demands. Vittorio Orlando, Italy. Representing Italy, Orlando's primary concern was securing the territorial gains promised to Italy in the secret Treaty of London of 1915, lands in Trentino, Trieste, and Dalmatia. He often felt sidelined by the larger powers, and his demands contributed to the complexity and frustration of the negotiations. The clash of these formidable personalities and their fundamentally incompatible visions, Wilson's idealism versus Clemenceau's desire for punishment, tempered by Lloyd George's pragmatism, would ultimately determine the shape of the post-war world and sow the seeds of its undoing. Idealism versus revenge, Wilson's 14 points against Allied fury. The fundamental tension at the Paris Peace Conference was the stark contrast between President Wilson's ambitious, forward-looking vision for a new global order and the European allies' visceral demand for retribution and reparations. Wilson's 14 points, articulated in January 1918, had promised a world free from secret treaties, with freedom of the seas, reduced armaments, self-determination for all peoples, and the crowning jewel, a League of Nations to ensure collective security and prevent future wars. This vision offered a hopeful alternative to the cycles of violence that had plagued Europe. However, the European powers, particularly France and Belgium, had borne the brunt of the war's devastation. Their populations demanded not lofty ideals, but justice, security, and compensation for their immense losses. They viewed Wilson's idealism as naive, even dangerous, failing to grasp the deep-seated historical animosities and immediate security concerns. Clemenceau famously remarked, "Mr. Wilson has 14 points, God Almighty has only 10. Wilson was ultimately forced to compromise significantly on many of his points to secure the one he held dearest, the creation of the League of Nations. This sacrifice allowed the punitive desires of France and, to a lesser extent, Britain, to dominate the final terms, particularly those imposed on Germany. The resulting peace was thus a fragile hybrid, a testament to unfulfilled idealism and the enduring power of wartime fury. Versailles Verdict, the treaty that broke Germany and set the stage for the next war. The culminating document of the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles, was signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the same place where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871. For the Germans, who were excluded from the negotiations and merely presented with the final text, it was a diktat, a dictated peace. Its 440 clauses, designed to dismantle German power and exact retribution, inadvertently became the primary catalyst for deep-seated resentment that would lead directly to the next global conflict. Stripped bare, Germany's territorial humiliation. The treaty mercilessly carved up German territory, aiming to weaken its strategic position and economic base. Alsace-Lorraine, annexed by Germany in 1871, was returned to France. The rich coal-producing Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations administration for 15 years, with its coal mines directly ceded to France. Smaller territories like Eupen-Malmedy went to Belgium, and northern Schleswig to Denmark after a plebiscite. To give newly independent Poland access to the sea, a Polish corridor was created, cutting East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. The largely German city of Danzig, modern Gdansk, was made a free city under League of Nations control, further inflaming German nationalist sentiment. Perhaps most gallingly, Germany was stripped of all its overseas colonies, which were divided among the Allied powers as mandates, a concept we will explore later. In total, Germany lost 13% of its pre-war territory, 10% of its population, 75% of its iron ore, and 26% of its coal and potash production. This massive territorial humiliation, viewed as a direct assault on German sovereignty and national pride, became a constant source of grievance for nationalists. The big lie of national self-determination applied to some, but not to the defeated Germans. The caged giant, military restrictions designed to cripple. To ensure Germany could never again pose a military threat, the Treaty of Versailles imposed incredibly harsh restrictions on its armed forces. The goal was to transform Germany into a caged giant. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland bordering France and Belgium, was permanently demilitarized. No German troops or fortifications were allowed there, and Allied forces were to occupy it for 15 years as a security guarantee. The German army was severely limited to just 100,000 men, all of whom had to be long-service volunteers, effectively eliminating conscription and denying Germany a large reserve force. The German navy was also drastically reduced, forbidden from possessing submarines or large battleships, and its existing fleet was interned and then scuttled at Scapa Flow. Germany was expressly forbidden from possessing an air force of any kind. These military clauses were intended to cripple Germany's war-making capabilities. However, they were perceived by Germans as a profound humiliation, disproportionate and unjust for a sovereign nation. This fostered a deep desire for rearmament and a dismantling of the treaty's restrictions, contributing directly to the militaristic ambitions of the Weimar Republic's successors. The war guilt lie, Article 231 and its unbearable burden. The most controversial and resented clause of the entire treaty was Article 231, often referred to as the War Guilt Clause. This clause forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing all the loss and damage suffered by the Allied powers during the war. While the origins of the war were complex and multifaceted, Article 231 presented a simplistic, punitive narrative of German culpability. It served as the legal justification for the imposition of crippling reparations payments, intended to compensate the Allies for war damages. The exact sum was not fixed at Versailles, but later set at an astronomical £6.6 billion, 132 billion gold marks, a figure far beyond Germany's capacity to pay without destroying its economy. The economic impact was devastating. Germany, already reeling from the war and blockade, struggled to meet the payments, leading to severe economic hardship, rampant hyperinflation in the early 1920s, and widespread poverty. The psychological and political impact was even more profound. Germans across the political spectrum felt a profound sense of injustice and humiliation. The war WWII became a powerful rallying cry for extreme nationalist groups, who propagated the infamous stab-in-the-back myth, Dolchstoßlegende, that the German army had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed by socialist politicians and Jews on the home front who signed the Armistice and accepted the Diktat of Versailles. This myth undermined the fledgling Weimar Republic and became a central pillar of Adolf Hitler's propaganda, providing fertile ground for his rise to power. Occupation and resentment, the Allied presence in Germany. Adding insult to injury, Allied forces occupied the Rhineland, serving as a constant, visible reminder of Germany's defeat and the terms of the treaty. French, British, Belgian, and American troops were stationed on German soil, with the occupation intended for periods of 5, 10, or 15 years, and potentially longer if Germany failed to meet its obligations. This occupation, meant to provide security for France and guarantee reparations payments, instead became a festering wound. It fueled deep resentment and nationalist fervor among Germans, who viewed the foreign presence as an enduring symbol of their humiliation and the diktat that had been imposed upon them. Reshaping a continent, other treaties, other sorrows. While Versailles dealt with Germany, separate, equally punitive treaties carved up the remaining Central Powers, redrawing the map of Europe and the Middle East with scant regard for ethnic realities, and creating new sources of grievance and instability. Saint-Germain and Trianon, the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary. The sprawling, multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire, whose very collapse contributed to the Armistice, was formally dissolved by two treaties. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, 1919, was signed with Austria, reducing it to a small, landlocked German-speaking republic. The Treaty of Trianon, 1920, with Hungary was equally punitive, severely reducing Hungary's territory. These treaties, while ostensibly guided by Wilson's principle of self-determination, led to the creation of new nation-states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and significantly enlarged Poland and Romania. However, the redrawing of borders was often clumsy, leaving large ethnic minorities, millions of Germans in Czechoslovakia, Hungarians in Romania, Serbs in Croatia, and so on the wrong side of the new frontiers. This created bitter irredentist movements and laid enduring seeds for future ethnic conflicts and territorial disputes that would plague Central and Eastern Europe for decades, contributing to the instability that Hitler would later exploit. Sèvres and Lausanne, the Ottoman Empire's final demise and the birth of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, met its final demise through the treaties. The initial Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, was an incredibly harsh document that aimed to completely dismantle the Ottoman Empire, leaving only a small, landlocked Turkish state in Anatolia and ceding vast territories to Greece, Italy, and Armenia. Crucially, Sèvres formalized the impact of the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916, between Britain and France, which had carved up the Middle East into spheres of influence. Former Ottoman territories like Syria, Lebanon, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Palestine were placed under the mandate system of the League of Nations, but effectively controlled by Britain and France. This was a big lie of self-determination, merely rebranding colonialism under a new international veneer. The harsh terms of Sèvres sparked the Turkish War of Independence under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The Treaty of Sèvres was rejected by the new Turkish nationalist government, and following military victories, it was replaced by the more equitable Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. Lausanne recognized a sovereign Turkish republic within more secure borders, but the Arab mandates remained, creating a legacy of Western interference and unresolved national aspirations in the Middle East that persist to this day. Wilson's dream and its demise, the League of Nations' fragile hope. Amidst the punitive atmosphere of the peace treaties, President Wilson held fast to his greatest hope for a truly lasting peace, the creation of a new international body that would ensure collective security and prevent future wars. The promise of peace, its formation, structure, and aims. The League of Nations was a central pillar of the Treaty of Versailles and the embodiment of Wilson's idealistic vision. Its formation in 1920 represented a revolutionary step towards international cooperation. Its primary aims were collective security. An attack on one member was to be considered an attack on all, theoretically deterring aggression. Disarmament, international cooperation on social and economic issues, and the peaceful arbitration of disputes between nations. The League structure included a council, composed of great powers and elected members, an assembly, representing all member states, a permanent court of international justice, and various commissions dealing with issues like health, labor, and refugees. The promise was monumental, a world where dialogue replaced destruction. America's rejection, why the U.S. turned its back on its own creation. In a bitter irony that crippled the League from its inception, President Wilson's own nation ultimately turned its back on his creation. Despite his passionate advocacy, the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and, crucially, American membership in the League of Nations. Several factors contributed to this devastating blow: a powerful surge of isolationist sentiment in the post-war era, a pervasive fear of being drawn into future European conflicts, concerns over Article X, the Collective Security Clause, which implied an obligation to send troops abroad, and a bitter partisan battle between Wilson and his Republican opponents. Without the global power, economic might, and moral leadership of the United States, the League of Nations was significantly weakened from its very first day. It lacked the necessary teeth to enforce its decisions and compel compliance from powerful aggressors in the decades to come. The big lie of universal cooperation, so central to Wilson's vision, faltered at its very birth. The mandate system, colonialism rebranded? One of the League of Nations' direct responsibilities was the administration of the mandate system. Under this system, the former German colonies and territories of the dissolved Ottoman Empire were not to be annexed outright by the victors but administered by Allied powers, Britain, France, Belgium, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, under the tutelage of the League. These territories were classified into A, B, and C mandates, ostensibly based on their readiness for independence. Class A mandates, like Syria and Iraq, were supposedly nearing self-determination, while Class B, like German East Africa, and Class C, like German Southwest Africa, were deemed less developed and largely integrated into the mandating powers' empire. While presented as a benevolent step towards decolonization, critics argued it was merely colonialism rebranded, allowing the victors to expand their empires under a thin veneer of international supervision and Wilsonian idealism. This big lie of tutelage over true self-determination further fueled anti-colonial sentiments that would erupt into powerful nationalist movements in the decades that followed, shaping the struggles for independence that continue to define the 20th and 21st centuries.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please don't forget to like, comment and share this video. Also don't forget to subscribe the channel and press the bell icon, so that you don't miss out the next video. For now, you can continue with the next video or can go through the complete playlist provided here.